The silver locket slipped from Wilhelmina Flynn's trembling fingers, hitting the pawnshop counter with a soft clink that seemed to echo through her shattered heart. 3 days without food had driven her here, to the last place in Silverwater Creek she'd ever imagined standing. $2, the shopkeeper said flatly, barely glancing at the gleaming pendant that contained the only image of her late husband. Wilhelmina's throat tightened. It was 1877, 2 years since the influenza had taken Robert, leaving her with nothing but memories, debts, and the small homestead she could barely maintain on the outskirts of town. At 26, widowhood had worn her thin as parchment, though her honey blonde hair and clear blue eyes still carried traces of the beauty that had once turned heads throughout the territory. "It was my wedding gift," she whispered. "The silver alone is worth $2, the man repeated, unmoved. "Take it or find another shop." His eyes flicked toward the door where another customer had entered, spurs jingling softly against the wooden floorboards. Wilhelmina blinked back tears. $2 would barely buy enough flour and beans to last the week, but the alternative was starvation, and Robert wouldn't have wanted that. Her fingers closed around the locket one last time, thumb brushing over the intricate engravings of intertwined roses. "I'll give you 20 for it." The deep voice startled her. Wilhelmina turned to find a tall man standing nearby, his broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the late afternoon light streaming through the shop's dusty window. His face was partially shadowed by a well-worn cowboy hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened with several days' stubble. "Sir, that's far too generous," she managed, though her stomach clenched at the thought of refusing such an offer when hunger gnawed at her insides. The stranger stepped closer, and Wilhelmina could now see his face clearly. He couldn't have been more than 30, with intelligent hazel eyes that studied her with unexpected gentleness. His clothes bore the dust of the trail, but there was something deliberate in his movements that suggested he was more than a drifter. "Thomas Norwood," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "And I don't make offers I don't mean, madam." The shopkeeper's eyes had widened at the sum mentioned. "The lady and I were discussing $2, he interjected quickly. Thomas Norwood's gaze never left Wilhelmina's face. "I believe I was speaking to the lady, not you." He reached into his pocket and placed $20 on the counter between them. Something this precious shouldn't go for less than it's worth. Wilhelmina's hand hovered protectively over the locket. "It's just silver, Mr. Norwood, and a small photograph inside." "Sometimes the value of a thing isn't in what it's made of," he replied, his voice softening, "but in what it means." Their eyes met, and something inexplicable passed between them, a current of understanding that left Wilhelmina momentarily breathless. This stranger somehow recognized what she was sacrificing. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the locket. Hesitantly, she pushed it toward him. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he opened the clasp, revealing the small daguerreotype of Robert in his Sunday best, smiling faintly at a bride who no longer existed except in memory. Thomas studied the image, then closed the locket carefully. To her astonishment, he extended his hand, offering it back to her along with the $20. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. She nodded, confused. "Robert. He passed 2 years ago, then you should keep this." He pressed both the money and the locket into her palm, closing her fingers around them. "Your heart is my treasure, madam, not some trinket to be bartered away when times are hard." Wilhelmina stared at him, uncomprehending. "I don't understand." "What I mean to say is," Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly looking less sure of himself, "no one should have to sell their memories to survive. The money is yours, and so is the locket." The shopkeeper made a noise of protest, but Thomas silenced him with a sharp glance. "Mr. Norwood, I cannot accept." "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you will. Consider it an investment in your future rather than charity." An investment? The word felt foreign on her tongue. No one had invested in anything related to Wilhelmina Flynn in a very long time. "I've just purchased the old Lawson Ranch," Thomas explained. "I'll be needing help getting it in order. Perhaps you'd be willing to cook for my crew, at least until we're properly established. That would more than settle any debt you feel you owe me." Wilhelmina clutched the locket and money, feeling a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years' hope. "I'm a good cook," she said softly, "and I could use the work." Thomas Norwood smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face into something approaching handsome. "Then it's settled. I'll send a wagon for you tomorrow morning if that suits." As Wilhelmina stepped out of the pawnshop into the fading light of day, the locket once again hanging around her neck where it belonged, she couldn't help but wonder what twist of fate had sent Thomas Norwood through the door at precisely that moment. Whatever the reason, for the first time since Robert's death, tomorrow seemed like something to look forward to rather than endure. The following morning arrived with a clarity that matched Wilhelmina's newfound sense of purpose. She had spent the night baking bread with some of the flour she'd purchased, determined to arrive at her new position with something to offer beyond her labor. The $20 had been carefully divided, a portion for immediate needs, the rest hidden beneath a loose floorboard for emergencies. The promised wagon arrived just after sunrise, driven by a weathered man who introduced himself as Eugene, the foreman of Norwood's ranch. He tipped his hat respectfully as she climbed aboard with her small bundle of possessions and the basket of fresh bread. "Mr. Norwood speaks highly of you, madam," Eugene remarked as they pulled away from her homestead. "Says you're going to civilize our mealtimes." Wilhelmina managed a small smile. "I'm not certain what Mr. Norwood told you, but we only met yesterday," Eugene chuckled. "That's the boss for you, makes up his mind quick about people, says he can read 'em like wanted posters." The journey to the Lawson Ranch, or the Norwood Ranch as it was now, took nearly an hour. As they crested the final hill, Wilhelmina caught her breath at the sight spread before her. The property was vast, with rolling pastures extending toward distant mountains. The main house was larger than she had imagined, a two-story structure in need of repair but solid in its foundations. Several outbuildings dotted the landscape, and men were already at work mending fences and clearing brush. Thomas Norwood emerged from the barn as the wagon pulled into the yard. He wore no jacket today, just a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms tanned by the sun. He smiled upon seeing her, and Wilhelmina was struck again by how that simple expression transformed his entire countenance. "Mrs. Flynn," he greeted her, helping her down from the wagon. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," she replied, suddenly aware of her faded dress and worn boots. "I've brought some fresh bread as a small thank you." Thomas accepted the basket with evident pleasure. "That's mighty thoughtful." "The men will be ecstatic. We've been surviving on Eugene's cooking, which is fit only for horses with no sense of taste." Eugene grumbled good-naturedly as he drove the wagon toward the barn. "Let me show you the kitchen," Thomas said, guiding her toward the house. "I'm afraid it's been neglected since old Lawson's wife passed 5 years back." The house interior was surprisingly spacious, if dusty. The kitchen was equipped with a large cast-iron stove, ample workspace, and a pantry that, while currently sparse, could easily store provisions for a dozen men or more. "It's perfect," Wilhelmina breathed, already envisioning how she would organize the space. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "I've had supplies ordered from town: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt pork, and such. They should arrive by midday. How many am I cooking for?" 7 hands plus Eugene and myself, 9 total. Wilhelmina nodded, mentally calculating quantities. "And will you be taking all meals here or just supper?" "Breakfast and supper in the house. Midday meal is usually wherever the men are working." Thomas paused, studying her. "I realize now I should have discussed wages yesterday." "Oh." Wilhelmina hadn't even considered that aspect, so grateful had she been for the $20 and the chance to keep her locket. $30 a month plus room and board, he stated. Your quarters would be upstairs, the small bedroom off the landing. It has its own entrance, so you'll have privacy. The sum was generous, more than generous for a cook's position, and Wilhelmina couldn't hide her surprise. Mr. Norwood, that's fair compensation for keeping 9 hungry men fed and content, he interrupted smoothly. I've learned that good food makes for loyal workers. She sensed there was more to his generosity than business sense, but didn't press the matter. Then I accept, and I'll do my best to earn every penny. Thomas smiled again, that transformative expression that reached his eyes. I have no doubt, Mrs. Flynn. He straightened from the doorframe. I'll have your things brought up to your room. Take today to settle in and organize as you see fit. Supper at 6. With that, he left her to explore her new domain, his spurs jingling softly as he walked away. By afternoon, Wilhelmina had scrubbed the kitchen to a gleaming state and organized the delivered supplies. The work was physical but satisfying, giving her less time to dwell on the strange turn her life had taken. After the isolation of her small homestead, the bustling activity of the ranch was a welcome change. For supper, she prepared a hearty beef stew with fresh biscuits and apple pie for dessert. As the men filed in, each nodded respectfully, introducing themselves before taking seats at the long oak table. Thomas came in last, freshly washed, his damp hair combed back from his forehead. "Something smells wonderful," he remarked, taking his place at the head of the table. The meal passed with enthusiastic appreciation from the ranch hands, who seemed unaccustomed to such care in their food. Thomas ate quietly, occasionally joining in the good-natured conversation, but mostly observing. Several times, Wilhelmina caught him watching her as she moved about, serving and clearing dishes. When the men had finished and drifted outside to smoke their evening pipes, Thomas remained, helping her gather the last of the plates. "You've won them over already," he commented. Eugene hasn't stopped smiling since the first bite. Wilhelmina felt a blush warm her cheeks. "It's just simple cooking." "There's nothing simple about comfort," Thomas replied, handing her a stack of plates. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Wilhelmina felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. "Tell me about your homestead, Mrs. Flynn. Will it be all right unattended?" The question brought reality crashing back. "I hadn't considered," she began, concern creasing her brow. "Perhaps you could ride out to check on it weekly," Thomas suggested. "Eugene could accompany you." Wilhelmina nodded gratefully. "That would ease my mind. It's not much, but it's all I have left of my life with Robert." At the mention of her husband, Thomas's expression softened. "How long were you married?" 4 years. She busied herself with wiping down the table. "We came west from Pennsylvania right after our wedding. Robert had dreams of building something of our own." "And did you? Build something, I mean." Wilhelmina paused, considering. "We built a life for a time. It wasn't grand, but it was ours." Her hand unconsciously rose to touch the locket at her throat. Thomas noticed the gesture. "May I ask what happened to him?" "Influenza," she replied quietly. "It swept through the area 2 winters ago. Many didn't survive." "I'm sorry." The simple words carried genuine sympathy. "Loss like that. It changes the landscape of your world." Something in his tone made Wilhelmina look up sharply. "You speak as though from experience, Mr. Norwood." A shadow crossed his face. "My wife, Caroline, 4 years ago, childbirth." "And the child?" Thomas shook his head slightly. "My son lived only a few hours." Wilhelmina's heart constricted at the pain evident in his voice. "I am truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Norwood." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "If we're to be sharing a roof, perhaps we could dispense with formalities." "Then you must call me Wilhelmina," she replied, "though most call me Willa." "Willa," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it. "It suits you straightforward, yet graceful." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and for a moment, Wilhelmina felt the strange connection she'd experienced in the pawnshop return, stronger now. Two people who understood loss, standing in a kitchen filled with the remnants of a meal meant to nourish bodies and perhaps souls. Thomas broke the silence first. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will be another full day." As he left, Wilhelmina found herself watching his retreating figure, wondering what circumstances had truly brought Thomas Norwood to that pawnshop at the exact moment she'd been about to surrender her most precious possession. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of work that Wilhelmina found surprisingly fulfilling. She rose before dawn each day to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent mornings baking and preparing the midday meal. afternoons preserving summer fruits or mending linens, and evenings cooking elaborate suppers that brought genuine joy to the hard-working men. Thomas was often away during the day, overseeing the ranch operations or making trips to neighboring properties to discuss business. But he was invariably present at breakfast and supper, and Wilhelmina gradually noticed how he'd linger after the other men had departed, offering to help with dishes or simply sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, sharing stories of his day. She learned that he had come from St. Louis, where his family had made a fortune in shipping. He'd married young to Caroline, the daughter of his father's business partner, and their life had been comfortable if somewhat prescribed by social expectations. "After I lost them, the city felt like a cage," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. "Every street, every building held memories I couldn't escape." Wilhelmina nodded, understanding perfectly. "So you came west." "First to Denver, then through the territories. I worked ranches, tried my hand at mining, even drove cattle for a spell." He smiled ruefully. "I was searching for something, though I couldn't have named it. And did you find it?" she asked softly. Thomas looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "I'm beginning to think I might have." The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Wilhelmina felt her heart quicken, and she turned her gaze back to the sunset, grateful for the rosy light that might disguise the flush she felt spreading across her cheeks. As summer progressed toward autumn, the ranch transformed under Thomas's direction. Cattle were purchased, fences mended, and the house gradually became more welcoming as Wilhelmina added small touches: wildflowers in mason jars, curtains sewn from fabric purchased in town, rugs beaten and returned to floors that had known only dust for years. Each week, Eugene accompanied her to check on her homestead, which remained undisturbed but increasingly felt less like home. On these visits, Wilhelmina would tend her small garden, airing out the cabin and sometimes bringing back vegetables or herbs to supplement the ranch's pantry. It was on one such return journey, as August heat shimmered across the landscape, that Eugene broke from his usual taciturn manner. "Boss has changed since you came, Mrs. Flynn," he remarked as the wagon bounced along the rutted road. Wilhelmina glanced at him, surprised. "How do you mean?" Eugene considered his words carefully. "When Mr. Norwood hired me in Denver last year, he was distant, driven, sure, but like a man running from something. Now he's planning, looking ahead, talks about next season's breeding program, expanding the orchard." He gave her a significant look. "Man doesn't plant trees unless he's planning to stay and watch them grow." She didn't know how to respond to the implied connection between her arrival and Thomas's apparent newfound roots. Instead, she adjusted her bonnet against the sun and asked about Eugene's family back in Kansas. As they approached the ranch, they saw a cloud of dust in the distance that resolved into riders as they drew closer. Thomas and two of the hands, returning from the north pasture. Thomas broke away from the others, guiding his chestnut gelding toward their wagon. "Good afternoon," he called, bringing his horse alongside. His face was tanned from days in the sun, eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at Wilhelmina. "How was your homestead?" "Undisturbed," she replied. "I've brought back some tomatoes and late summer squash." "Excellent." "We have guests tonight, the Baldwins from the neighboring ranch and Sheriff Parker from town. I hope that's not too much additional work." Wilhelmina assured him it wasn't, though her mind immediately began calculating adjustments to the evening's planned meal. Thomas rode alongside the wagon the rest of the way to the house, filling her in on the ranch activities she'd missed that morning. As Eugene helped her down from the wagon, Thomas dismounted and approached with something in his hand. "I found this in town last week," he said, extending a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like it for the kitchen." Wilhelmina unwrapped the gift to find a beautiful carved wooden spoon, the handle decorated with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. "It's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "The merchant said it came from back east, reminded me of those Pennsylvania roots of yours." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you, Thomas, I'll treasure it." His eyes warmed at her use of his first name, which still didn't come naturally to her despite his invitation weeks earlier. "You're welcome, Willa." The evening's dinner was a success, with Mrs. Baldwin particularly complimentary about Wilhelmina's apple spice cake. Sheriff Parker, a stout man with an impressive mustache, regaled them with tales of his days as a Texas Ranger before settling in the relatively quiet town of Silverwater Creek. "Course, we have our share of trouble," he was saying as they lingered over coffee. "Just last month caught a fellow trying to pass counterfeit banknotes at Jenkins' General Store." "Any strangers in town lately?" Thomas asked, seemingly casual though Wilhelmina detected an undercurrent of tension in his voice. The sheriff considered. "Couple of travelers passed through last week, one asking particular questions about new property owners in the area." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What sort of questions?" "Wanted to know about anyone who'd purchased land recently, especially from back east." "Said he was representing investors." Sheriff Parker twirled his mustache thoughtfully. "Didn't like the look of him myself, told him our records were private unless he had official business." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Wilhelmina noticed how Thomas remained distracted for the remainder of the evening, his earlier good humor dimmed. When their guests finally departed, she found him standing on the porch, staring into the darkness. "Is everything all right?" she asked, joining him. Thomas seemed to shake himself from deep thoughts. "Just ranch concerns," he replied, though she sensed it wasn't the entire truth. "You outdid yourself tonight, Willa. The Baldwins will be singing your praises across the county." "I'm glad they enjoyed it." She hesitated, then added, "You seemed troubled by what the sheriff said about the stranger asking questions." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "It's probably nothing," he finally said. "Just old habits of caution, from your days of wandering." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Something like that." He turned to face her fully. "Willa, I've been meaning to ask your homestead. Have you considered what you'll do with it when winter comes? The trail can be impassable after heavy snow." The question caught her off guard. She hadn't thought that far ahead, assuming she would simply return to her cabin when her arrangement with Thomas concluded, whenever that might be. "I suppose I hadn't planned that far," she admitted. Thomas leaned against the porch railing. "You could stay on here if you'd like." "Through winter, at least." The offer warmed her like a physical touch. "That's very kind." "It's not kindness," he replied quietly. "The ranch needs you. The men would revolt if I let you go now that they've grown accustomed to actual food instead of Eugene's attempts at cooking." They shared a smile at that, but something deeper hung in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps it wasn't only the ranch that needed her presence. "Then I'll stay," Wilhelmina said, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the locket at her throat, a gesture that had become less frequent in recent weeks, she realized. Thomas's eyes followed the movement, lingering on the silver pendant before returning to her face. "I'm glad," he said simply, and in those two words Wilhelmina heard volumes that neither of them was quite ready to voice. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of gold touching the aspen trees that dotted the surrounding hills. Ranch life intensified as preparations for winter began in earnest. Hay was stored, wood chopped and stacked, and the last of the summer's bounty preserved in Wilhelmina's increasingly well-stocked pantry. One crisp morning, as frost silvered the grass, Thomas announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to Denver on business. "I'll be gone about 10 days, he told Wilhelmina as the ranch hands filed out to begin their day's work. "Eugene will handle things here, but if there's anything you need from the city, I'd be happy to bring it back," she thought for a moment. "Perhaps some spices if you have time, cinnamon and nutmeg for the autumn baking. Consider it done." He lingered, coffee cup in hand. "Will you be all right here while I'm gone?" The concern in his voice brought a smile to her lips. "I managed on my own for 2 years after Robert died, Thomas. I think I can survive 10 days with Eugene and the boys looking after me." He acknowledged this with a nod, though something like worry still creased his brow. "Of course, it's just," he broke off, then continued more carefully, "the ranch won't feel the same without you here." Wilhelmina felt her cheeks warm at the slip that revealed more than perhaps he'd intended. "I believe you have that backwards," she corrected gently. "I'm the one staying, you're the one leaving." Thomas smiled at that, the tension in his face easing. "So I am." He set down his cup and, in a gesture that surprised them both, reached out to briefly touch her hand where it rested on the table. "Take care, Willa. I'll return as soon as I can." The contact was fleeting but electric, sending a current up her arm that left her momentarily speechless. By the time she recovered, Thomas had already moved toward the door. "Safe travels," she called after him, and was rewarded with a final smile before he disappeared into the bright morning. Thomas's absence affected Wilhelmina more than she had anticipated. The days seemed longer, the house emptier despite the continued presence of the ranch hands. She found herself looking up at the sound of approaching horses, only to be disappointed when it wasn't Thomas returning early from his journey. Eugene noted her distraction as they rode out to check her homestead the following week. "Missing the boss?" he asked, his weathered face revealing nothing but kindness. Wilhelmina straightened in the wagon seat. "The house is certainly quieter without him," she replied, attempting nonchalance. Eugene made a non-committal sound. Known Thomas Norwood for over a year now, never seen him settle anywhere like he has here. He glanced at her sidelong. "Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, either." The directness of the statement left her flustered. "Mr. Norwood has been very kind to me." "Kindness ain't what I'm talking about, Mrs. Flynn, and you know it." Eugene's tone remained gentle despite the boldness of his words. "Man carries his ghosts close, but since you came, they seem to weigh less on him." Wilhelmina didn't know how to respond. She had noticed the changes in Thomas over the past months, how his smiles came more readily, how the shadows behind his eyes had gradually lightened. But she had attributed this to his success with the ranch, to finding purpose in building something new. "We've both lost spouses," she said finally. "Perhaps there's comfort in shared understanding." Eugene nodded slowly. "Perhaps, or perhaps there's more to it than that." They rode the rest of the way in silence. Wilhelmina's thoughts churning with possibilities she had been careful not to examine too closely. At the homestead, she went through her usual routine of airing out the cabin and checking for any signs of disturbance. The garden had begun to wither with the advancing autumn, but she gathered the last of the hardy greens and root vegetables. As she worked, her eyes kept drifting to the distant horizon in the direction of Denver. What business had taken Thomas there? He hadn't specified, and she hadn't felt it her place to ask. But now, with Eugene's words echoing in her mind, she found herself wondering about the man who had so unexpectedly become central to her life. How much did she really know about Thomas Norwood? He had shared stories of his past, of course his life in St. Louis, the loss of his wife and child, his subsequent wanderings. But there were gaps, subtle evasions when certain topics arose, like his reaction to the sheriff's mention of strangers asking questions. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Eugene helped her down from the wagon, then paused before taking the horses to the barn. "Mrs. Flynn," he said hesitantly, "I hope I didn't speak out of turn earlier." Wilhelmina shook her head. "Not at all, Eugene. You've given me much to think about, that's all," he nodded, satisfied. "Boss should be back in 3 days if his letter is accurate," he wrote. This was news to her. "Got a telegram yesterday from Denver." "Everything's proceeding as planned," he said. "Asked after you specifically." Eugene's eyes twinkled briefly. "Told me to make sure you weren't working too hard in his absence." With that, he led the horses away, leaving Wilhelmina on the porch with her basket of vegetables and swirling thoughts. That night, as she prepared a simpler supper than usual for the remaining ranch hands, Wilhelmina found herself examining her feelings with new clarity. The truth was undeniable: she had begun to care deeply for Thomas Norwood. More than care. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Robert had been dead for over 2 years, yet until recently, Wilhelmina had never considered the possibility of another attachment. Her heart had been entombed alongside her husband, or so she'd believed. Now, awakened by Thomas's quiet strength and unexpected tenderness, it beat with renewed vigor, sending emotions coursing through her that she had thought forever lost. But what of Thomas's feelings? Eugene seemed certain, but men could be notoriously blind to matters of the heart. What if she had misinterpreted kindness for something more? The humiliation of such a mistake would be unbearable, forcing her to leave the place that had become more home to her than her own homestead. As she lay in bed that night, fingers absently tracing the outline of her locket, Wilhelmina made a decision. When Thomas returned, she would pay closer attention, looking for true signs of his feelings rather than projecting her own hopes. And if the opportunity presented itself, perhaps she would find the courage to speak of what had grown between them over these months. With that resolution, she finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of hazel eyes and gentle hands. The following days passed in a flurry of activity as Wilhelmina threw herself into preparations for Thomas's return. She baked his favorite apple spice cake, polished the neglected silver she'd discovered in a cabinet, and even asked one of the ranch hands to bring her wildflowers from the meadow to brighten the dining table. On the morning of Thomas's expected return, she wore her best dress, a modest blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her hair with extra care. The ranch hands exchanged knowing glances, but wisely kept their observations to themselves. By midday, there was still no sign of him. Wilhelmina tried not to show her disappointment as she served the men their noon meal. Roads might be slow with the recent rain, Eugene offered. Noting her frequent glances toward the window, she nodded, forcing a smile. Of course. I'm sure he'll arrive when he arrives. But as afternoon stretched into evening with no appearance by Thomas, concern began to replace disappointment. What if something had happened on the road? Bandits were not uncommon, and the journey from Denver was long. Supper was a subdued affair, the ranch hands sensing her worry. Eugene assured her that delays were normal, that Thomas was more than capable of handling himself, but Wilhelmina could see his own concern behind the reassurances. She was washing the last of the dishes when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Not the measured pace of a traveler, but the urgent gallop of someone in haste. Drying her hands quickly, Wilhelmina hurried to the porch, where Eugene and several of the hands had already gathered. A lone rider emerged from the gathering darkness, pushing his horse hard up the final stretch to the ranch house. It wasn't Thomas. The stranger reined in sharply, his mount lathered with exertion. I'm looking for Eugene Miller, he called out, scanning the assembled faces. Eugene stepped forward. That's me. What's this about? The rider dismounted, reaching into his jacket to produce an envelope. Message from Thomas Norwood, said it was urgent. Eugene took the envelope, breaking the seal as Wilhelmina moved closer, heart pounding with apprehension. What does it say? She asked, unable to contain herself. Eugene's weathered face grew grave as he read. Boss says he's been delayed. Says we need to prepare for possible trouble. He looked up at the messenger. When did he give you this? Yesterday morning in Denver, paid me extra to ride straight through. Eugene nodded grimly. Boys, we need to organize a watch rotation, 2 men at all times. He turned to Wilhelmina, his expression softening slightly. Mrs. Flynn, it might be best if you stayed at your homestead for a few days. What? No, she shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving without knowing what's happening. What kind of trouble is Thomas expecting? Eugene hesitated, then handed her the letter. See for yourself. Wilhelmina scanned the hastily written note, her blood running cold at the words. Eugene, they've found me. Ambrose's men. Delay in Denver necessary to throw them off, but not certain of success. Prepare ranch for possible trouble. Get Mrs. Flynn to safety if possible. Will return within 3 days. Destroy this letter. TN, she looked up, confusion and fear mingling in her chest. Who is Ambrose? Why would his men be looking for Thomas? Eugene sighed heavily. That's the boss's story to tell, not mine. But I will say this, Mr. Norwood made some powerful enemies back east before coming west. Is he in danger? Thomas can handle himself, Eugene replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Our job is to secure the ranch and follow his instructions. He nodded toward the letter still clutched in her hand. And destroy that, as he asked. Wilhelmina reluctantly surrendered the paper, watching as Eugene struck a match and set it aflame, letting the ashes scatter in the evening breeze. I'm not leaving, she stated firmly. If there's to be trouble, you'll need every hand available, and I'm not helpless. Eugene studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The boss won't like it, but I reckon arguing with you would be a waste of breath. A wise observation, she replied, managing a small smile despite her anxiety. As the ranch hands dispersed to organize the watch and secure the property, Wilhelmina returned to the kitchen, mind racing. Who was Thomas Norwood, really? What secrets had he carried west, and what danger now pursued him? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: her feelings remained unchanged. If anything, concern for his safety only intensified the emotions that had been growing within her. When Thomas returned, and she refused to consider any alternative, they would need to have a conversation about more than just their feelings for each other. 2 days passed in a state of tense vigilance. The ranch hands went about their duties with rifles close at hand, while Eugene organized regular patrols of the property boundaries. Wilhelmina kept busy in the kitchen, preparing meals and trying not to jump at every distant sound. On the morning of the 3rd day, as she was kneading bread dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary, Eugene appeared in the doorway. "Riders coming," he announced, his expression unreadable. "4 of them." Wilhelmina's hands stilled in the dough. "Thomas, can't tell yet. They're still at the far boundary." She wiped her hands on her apron, heart pounding. "I'm coming out." Together they walked to the porch, where several of the hands had already gathered, rifles at the ready. Wilhelmina shaded her eyes against the morning sun, straining to make out details of the approaching riders. "That's the boss's chestnut in front," one of the men said, relief evident in his voice. Wilhelmina sagged slightly with relief, then tensed again as she registered Eugene's continued vigilance. "Who are the others?" "That's what I'm wondering," Eugene muttered, not lowering his rifle. As the riders drew closer, Wilhelmina could finally make out Thomas in the lead, his familiar broad-shouldered silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. 3 men rode behind him, spread out in a formation that suggested caution rather than casual travel. When they reached the yard, Thomas dismounted first, his face grim but unharmed. His eyes found Wilhelmina immediately, a complex mix of emotions crossing his features: relief, concern, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Eugene," he called, nodding to his foreman before turning to introduce the men accompanying him. "These gentlemen are Marshal James Harker and deputies from the federal office in Denver." The tallest of the 3 strangers tipped his hat, revealing a badge pinned to his vest. "Madam," he acknowledged Wilhelmina. "Mr. Miller." Eugene lowered his rifle slightly. "Marshal, what brings you to our ranch?" "Protection detail," the marshal replied, "and some unfinished business with individuals who may be headed this way." Thomas moved to Wilhelmina's side, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You should be at your homestead. Didn't Eugene give you my message?" "He did," she replied steadily. "I chose to stay." A muscle twitched in Thomas's jaw. "This isn't a game, Willa." "These men, I'm not playing, Thomas," she interrupted. "This is my home too now. I won't be sent away at the first sign of trouble." Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Thomas exhaled sharply. "We'll discuss this later. For now, please stay inside while I get the marshal and his men settled." Wilhelmina wanted to argue further but recognized the genuine concern behind his directive. With a nod, she returned to the kitchen, though she left the door ajar to listen to the conversation on the porch. "Track them as far as Silverwater Creek," the marshal was saying. "They were asking questions about you specifically, Norwood." "Ambrose won't give up easily," Thomas replied, his voice tight. "The man's facing financial ruin with your testimony. He's desperate." "And dangerous," Thomas added. "He wouldn't send just anyone. These will be men willing to kill." Wilhelmina's hands trembled as she returned to her abandoned bread dough. What had Thomas been involved in back east? What testimony did he possess that could ruin a man named Ambrose? The questions multiplied as she worked, but answers would have to wait. For now, she would do what she could: provide sustenance and stability in the face of approaching danger. Late that afternoon, as Wilhelmina was preparing supper for the expanded household, Thomas finally sought her out. He entered the kitchen quietly, closing the door behind him to ensure privacy. "I owe you an explanation," he began without preamble. Wilhelmina continued slicing potatoes, not trusting herself to look at him directly. "Yes, you do." Thomas sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "Before I came west, I worked as an accountant for my father-in-law's shipping company in St. Louis," he began. "After Caroline and the baby died, I threw myself into work to escape the grief." Wilhelmina nodded, encouraging him to continue while keeping her hands busy with the meal preparations. "I discovered discrepancies in the accounts, significant sums being diverted to phantom companies. When I investigated further, I found that my father-in-law's business partner, Ambrose Whitfield, had been embezzling for years. Worse, he was using the company's ships to smuggle opium from the Orient." Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the ranch yard where the marshal and his deputies were consulting with Eugene. "I confronted Ambrose privately at first, thinking perhaps there was an explanation. Instead, he offered me a share in the profits to keep quiet." Thomas's voice hardened. "When I refused, he threatened me, said I'd never be believed over him, he was too respected in St. Louis society." "But you didn't stay quiet," Wilhelmina observed, finally looking up from her work. Thomas met her gaze, his expression grim. "I couldn't." The money he stole had come from hundreds of investors, including widows and orphans who had entrusted their savings to what they believed was a reputable firm. "And the opium," he shook his head. "I'd seen what that poison does to people." "So you went to the authorities?" "I gathered evidence for months, copying ledgers, collecting shipping manifests, documenting everything. When I finally took it to the federal prosecutor, they built a case against Ambrose and several of his associates." Wilhelmina set down her knife. "And now he's seeking revenge." Thomas nodded. "The trial is set for next month in St. Louis. I'm the key witness. Without my testimony, the case collapses. So these men he's sent are here to either kill me or ensure I never reach that courtroom." Thomas's bluntness was startling. "I'm sorry, Willa. I never meant to bring this danger to your door. When I came west, I thought I'd left it all behind. I changed my name slightly. It was Thomas Norton back in St. Louis and kept moving. But Ambrose has resources, and apparently he never stopped looking." Wilhelmina absorbed this information, her mind racing. "The ranch, is it even yours?" "Yes," Thomas assured her quickly. "Purchased legally under my current name. I earned the money honestly during my travels, some fortunate investments in mining operations, careful saving." He stepped closer. "I didn't lie about wanting to build something here, Willa. That was always true." She believed him, despite everything. The Thomas she had come to know over these months was a man of integrity, that much she was certain of. "What happens now?" she asked. "The marshal believes Ambrose's men will make their move soon. They've set up a perimeter around the ranch, and additional deputies are on their way from Denver." Thomas hesitated, then added softly, "I still wish you would consider staying at your homestead until this is resolved." Wilhelmina shook her head firmly. "My place is here." "Willa, no, Thomas, I won't run and hide while you face danger." She stepped toward him, closing the distance between them. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, a surrender. Slowly, he reached out to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "I don't deserve your loyalty," he murmured. "It's not about deserving," she replied, leaning slightly into his touch. "It's about choosing." For a moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then, distantly, they heard a shout from outside, one of the deputies calling for the marshal. Thomas's hand fell away as reality intruded. "I should see what's happening." Wilhelmina nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "Supper will be ready in an hour." As he moved toward the door, Thomas paused, turning back to her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When this is over, Willa, when it's safe, there's more I want to say to you." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the kitchen with potatoes half sliced and her heart racing with both fear and anticipation. Supper that evening was a tense affair. The marshal shared his strategy for defending the ranch, positioning men at key vantage points and establishing a rotation for night watches. Thomas contributed his knowledge of the property's layout, suggesting the most likely approaches that intruders might take. Wilhelmina served the meal silently, absorbing the gravity of the situation. These men were preparing for violence, perhaps even death. The reality of the danger contrasted sharply with the domestic scene of men gathered around her table, eating her food. As the conversation continued, a plan emerged. The marshal believed that capturing Ambrose's men alive would be ideal. They could potentially testify against their employer, strengthening the case. But no one harbored illusions about the visitors' intentions. These would be hardened men, likely hired for their willingness to kill. After the meal, as Wilhelmina cleared the dishes, Thomas approached her again. "There's a cellar beneath the pantry," he said quietly. "If you hear gunfire, I want you to go there immediately and bar the door from the inside." She wanted to protest, but saw the genuine fear for her safety in his eyes. "All right," she agreed, "but promise me you'll be careful." Thomas's expression softened. "I've got too much to live for to be anything else." The simple statement conveyed volumes, and Wilhelmina felt warmth spread through her chest despite the circumstances. Before she could respond, Eugene appeared in the doorway. "Boss, Marshal wants you outside." "Thinks he spotted movement near the south ridge." Thomas straightened, his expression shifting back to alertness. "Stay inside," he told Wilhelmina, then followed Eugene out into the gathering darkness. Alone in the kitchen, Wilhelmina finished cleaning up, her mind racing with worries and what-ifs. The idea of losing Thomas now, when whatever was growing between them had barely begun to bloom, was unbearable. She touched the locket at her throat, thinking of Robert. She had loved him truly, mourned him deeply. But life continued, and her heart had somehow found room for new feelings different but no less real. What would Robert have wanted for her? Surely not endless solitude and grief. A soft knock at the back door startled her from her thoughts. Cautiously, she approached, remembering Thomas's warnings. "Who is it?" she called through the closed door. "Mrs. Flynn." "It's John from Town Jenkins General Store. Got a delivery that couldn't wait till morning." Wilhelmina frowned. No deliveries had been scheduled, and certainly not at this hour. Through the small window in the door, she could make out a man holding what appeared to be a crate, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "I didn't order anything," she replied, not opening the door. "It's from Mr. Norwood," the man said. "Ordered it special from Denver, said it was important." Something about the situation felt wrong. Thomas would have mentioned a delivery, especially with the current state of alert, and why would a store clerk make such a journey after dark? "Please leave it on the step," she called. "I'll collect it in the morning." There was a pause, then the man's voice hardened slightly. "Madam, I need a signature." Boss was very clear about that. Making a swift decision, Wilhelmina backed away from the door. "I'm going to get Mr. Norwood." "Please wait there." She hurried toward the front of the house, intending to alert Thomas or the marshal, but froze at the sound of splintering wood. The back door crashed open, and heavy footsteps entered the kitchen. Wilhelmina darted into the pantry, frantically searching for the cellar entrance Thomas had mentioned. She found a trap door partially concealed beneath a rug, but before she could open it, rough hands seized her from behind. "Where's Norwood?" A harsh voice demanded as she was spun around to face her captor. The man bore no resemblance to any store clerk she'd ever seen. His face was scarred, his eyes cold and calculating beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, another man entered the kitchen, this one carrying a rifle. "I asked you a question, lady," the first man growled, his grip tightening painfully on her arms. Wilhelmina's fear gave way to anger. "And I don't answer to criminals who break into my home." The man's mouth twisted in an unpleasant smile. "Got spirit, I'll give you that. But Norwood's going to answer some questions whether you cooperate or not." He glanced at his companion. "Check upstairs, I'll keep an eye on her." As the second man moved toward the staircase, Wilhelmina's mind raced. Thomas and the others were outside, possibly at the far end of the property if they'd spotted movement at the south ridge. These men had deliberately drawn attention away from the house. "He's not here," she said, hoping to buy time. "Mr. Norwood left for Denver this morning." The man laughed harshly. "Nice try. We watched him ride in with the marshal earlier today." He pulled her roughly toward a chair. "Sit down and keep quiet." Wilhelmina complied, eyes darting around the kitchen for anything that might serve as a weapon. The cast iron skillet still sat on the stove, but it might as well have been miles away for all the good it did her now. "Ambrose Whitfield sent you," she said, attempting to keep the man talking. His eyebrows rose slightly. "So Norwood told you about his past. Interesting." He leaned against the table, keeping the gun trained on her. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield wants a word with his former employee, very badly, to stop him from testifying." The man shrugged. "That's between them. My job is to deliver Norwood to a meeting place. What happens after that is not my concern." Wilhelmina doubted Thomas would survive any such meeting. She needed to alert him somehow, but how? Her opportunity came unexpectedly. A shout from outside drew the man's attention briefly toward the window. In that moment of distraction, Wilhelmina lunged from the chair, seizing the heavy wooden spoon Thomas had given her from the counter and swinging it with all her might at the man's gun hand. The impact was solid. The man yelped in pain as the gun clattered to the floor. Wilhelmina dived for it, but he recovered quickly, kicking it away and grabbing her by the hair. "That was stupid," he snarled, yanking her upright. A gunshot exploded from upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The man holding Wilhelmina cursed, dragging her toward the door. "Change of plans," he muttered. "You're coming with us. Norwood will follow if we have what he values." Terror surged through Wilhelmina as she realized his intent. She fought wildly, clawing and kicking, but the man was too strong. As he pulled her through the doorway onto the back porch, she drew breath to scream for help. Before she could, a figure emerged from the shadows beside the door, moving with lethal precision. Thomas slammed into the man from the side, driving him away from Wilhelmina with such force that both men tumbled off the porch onto the hard ground below. Wilhelmina staggered backward against the doorframe, gasping for breath. More gunshots sounded from different directions, the marshal and his deputies engaging with other intruders, she realized. Below, Thomas and her captor grappled in the dirt, fighting for control. The man was larger, but Thomas fought with the desperate energy of someone protecting what he cared about most. He landed a solid blow to the man's jaw, momentarily stunning him. "Willa, get inside," Thomas shouted, using the brief advantage to regain his feet. But the intruder recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his boot and lunging upward. Thomas twisted away, but not fast enough to completely avoid the blade. He grunted in pain as it sliced across his side. Ignoring Thomas's command, Wilhelmina grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack by the door and rushed down the steps. As the attacker prepared for another strike, she swung the log with all her strength, connecting solidly with the back of his head. The man crumpled instantly, the knife falling from his slack fingers. Thomas stared at her in astonishment, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. "I told you to get inside. And I told you we face things together," she replied, dropping the log and moving to support him as he swayed slightly. "You're hurt." Before he could respond, Eugene and one of the deputies appeared around the corner of the house, rifles ready. "Boss, Mrs. Flynn," Eugene called, rushing forward. "Are you all right?" "We're fine," Thomas answered, though his pained expression contradicted his words. "There's another one upstairs," the deputy nodded. "Marshall's got him, tried to escape through a window but took a bullet in the shoulder for his trouble." He knelt to secure the unconscious man at their feet. "This the one who grabbed Mrs. Flynn?" Thomas nodded grimly. "Take him to the marshal. And send someone for the doctor from town. Quietly, I don't want word spreading that might draw more of Ambrose's men." As Eugene and the deputy carried the unconscious intruder away, Wilhelmina led Thomas back into the house, ignoring his protests that he could walk unaided. "Sit," she commanded, guiding him to a kitchen chair. Let me see that wound. Thomas reluctantly allowed her to examine his side, wincing as she carefully lifted his blood-soaked shirt. It's not deep, she assessed, relief evident in her voice, but it needs cleaning and bandaging. As she gathered supplies, Thomas watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between wonder and profound tenderness. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "That man would have killed me if you hadn't intervened." Wilhelmina dampened a cloth with whiskey from the cabinet. "As I recall, you saved mine first." "I was terrified," Thomas admitted, his voice dropping lower. "When I realized they'd breached the house, when I heard that man's voice," he broke off, closing his eyes briefly. "I've never been so afraid, Willa, not for myself, but for you." Her hands stilled in their work. "I felt the same when I saw that knife." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something unspoken yet undeniable passed between them, an acknowledgement that fear for another's safety revealed the true depth of one's feelings. Gently, Wilhelmina cleaned the wound, apologizing when Thomas flinched at the sting of alcohol on raw flesh. As she worked, the sounds of activity continued outside, men calling to each other, horses being moved, the marshal giving orders. "What happens now?" she asked as she began bandaging his torso. Thomas sighed. "The marshal will take the prisoners back to Denver. I'll need to go as well to make a statement." His hand covered hers where it rested on the bandage. "But I'll return as soon as possible, I promise." Wilhelmina nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at his touch. "And then, will you still need to testify in St. Louis?" "Yes, the trial begins in 3 weeks." He hesitated, then continued softly, "I had planned to ask if you would consider coming with me." She looked up sharply. "To St. Louis, just for the trial," he clarified quickly. "Though if you found you liked the city." He left the thought unfinished, watching her face carefully. Wilhelmina considered his words and what lay beneath them. "That would depend on why you're asking me to come, Thomas." A small smile curved his lips. "I think you know why." "I'd like to hear you say it," she replied, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Thomas reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "Because I love you, Willa Flynn. Because somewhere between that pawn shop and this moment, you became essential to me in ways I never thought possible after Caroline died." The simple declaration, spoken so plainly yet with such depth of feeling, brought tears to Wilhelmina's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself." "Why afraid?" he asked, thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. It felt like a betrayal of Robert at first, and then she hesitated. "I was afraid of losing someone I loved again. Of experiencing that pain a second time." Thomas nodded in understanding. "I know that fear intimately. It kept me wandering for years, never allowing myself to form attachments." His hand moved to the locket at her throat. "But some treasures are worth the risk, aren't they?" "Yes," Wilhelmina agreed, covering his hand with her own. "They are." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Thomas leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer despite his injury, and Wilhelmina yielded willingly to the embrace, feeling as though something long broken within her was finally beginning to heal. When they separated, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed in what appeared to be both pain and wonder. "I never expected this," he murmured. "When I walked into that pawn shop and saw you about to sell your locket, I was just trying to help a woman in distress. I had no idea you would become the center of my world." Wilhelmina smiled, remembering his words from that day. "You said my heart was your treasure." "And so it is," he replied, opening his eyes to gaze at her with unmistakable love. "The most valuable thing I could ever hope to cherish." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. The marshal entered, his expression grim but satisfied. "We've secured all the intruders," he announced. 3 total, including the one you tackled, Norwood. They're being held in the barn under guard until we can transport them to Denver." He noticed Thomas's bandaged side. "You need a doctor." "Mrs. Flynn has tended to it," Thomas replied. "It's not serious," the marshal nodded. "We'll leave at first light. These men will face federal charges for attempted murder and conspiracy." With their testimony, Ambrose Whitfield won't see daylight for decades. After the marshal departed, Thomas turned back to Wilhelmina, taking her hands in his. I meant what I said about St. Louis. Will you come with me, not just for the trial, but after? She understood what he was asking: a future together, a life built on the foundation they had begun here at the ranch. The prospect was both thrilling and daunting. What about my homestead? She asked, though the question was more practical than hesitant. Keep it, Thomas suggested. As a reminder of your life with Robert, something to visit to honor that part of your past. He squeezed her hands gently. Our pasts made us who we are, Willa. I would never ask you to forget or diminish what you had with him. His understanding, so complete and genuine, confirmed what Wilhelmina already knew in her heart, that this man, who had entered her life by chance in a pawn shop, was someone she could build a future with. Yes, she said simply. I'll come with you to St. Louis and after. Thomas's smile was radiant despite his pain and exhaustion. I promise you won't regret it. I know I won't, she replied, leaning forward to seal her answer with another kiss. 3 weeks later, Wilhelmina stood on the platform of the Denver train station, her hand securely held in Thomas's as they prepared to board the eastbound train to St. Louis. The events at the ranch had concluded safely, with Ambrose's men transported to Denver and charged. Their testimony had indeed implicated their employer, adding substantial weight to the case against him. Eugene had been left in charge of the ranch, with strict instructions to send telegrams regularly with updates on the property and animals. The ranch hands had bid them farewell with genuine affection, particularly toward Wilhelmina, extracting promises that she would return to resume her cooking duties. As the conductor called for passengers to board, Thomas turned to her, his expression a mix of anticipation and lingering concern. Are you certain about this journey? He asked. It's not too late to change your mind. Wilhelmina smiled up at him, adjusting the locket that still hung around her neck, a connection to her past that she carried into her future without contradiction or conflict. I've never been more certain of anything, she assured him. Thomas's answering smile was brilliant. Then let's go face this together, Mrs. Flynn. Soon to be Mrs. Norwood, she reminded him softly, enjoying the way his eyes lit up at the words. They had decided to marry in St. Louis after the trial, in a small ceremony attended by a few of Thomas's former colleagues who had stood by him during the investigation. Then they would return to Colorado, to the ranch that had become home to them both. As they boarded the train and settled into their seats, Thomas kept hold of her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin. Do you remember what I said that day in the pawn shop? He asked. About your heart being my treasure. Wilhelmina nodded, the memory still vivid despite all that had happened since. I meant it then as a kindness to a stranger, Thomas continued, but now I understand it was a promise I didn't even know I was making. She leaned against his shoulder as the train lurched into motion, carrying them toward a future neither could have imagined when they first met. Some treasures find us when we least expect them, she replied softly, and turn out to be worth far more than silver or gold. Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. Or worth precisely their weight in love. As the train gathered speed, carrying them east toward closure and new beginnings, Wilhelmina Flynn closed her eyes in contentment. The locket around her neck held memories she would always cherish, but her heart, once locked away in grief, now beat with renewed purpose and joy, the most precious treasure she could offer to the man beside her, and he to her. 1 year later, Wilhelmina Norwood stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Thomas directed the hands in bringing in the last of the autumn harvest. The property had flourished under their joint care, expanding to include more cattle, an orchard beginning to bear fruit, and fields of wheat that shimmered gold in the late afternoon sun. The trial in St. Louis had concluded successfully, with Ambrose Whitfield sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. Thomas and Wilhelmina had married as planned, in a simple ceremony that nonetheless felt momentous in its significance, not an ending of their previous lives, but a continuation that honored what had come before while embracing what lay ahead. Their return to Colorado had been welcomed enthusiastically by Eugene and the ranch hands, who had maintained the property admirably in their absence. The homestead that had been Wilhelmina's shelter during her widowhood remained standing, visited occasionally but no longer needed as refuge. As Thomas finished his instructions and turned toward the house, Wilhelmina felt the now familiar warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him. At 31, he had lost the restless energy of a man running from his past, replaced by the steady purpose of one building a future. He smiled as he approached, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "The last of the pumpkins are in," he announced. "Eugene says we've had the best harvest he's seen in these parts for years." "Good soil and hard work," Wilhelmina replied, accepting his kiss, "and perhaps a touch of luck." Thomas's arm encircled her waist, his hand resting gently on the slight swell of her stomach, their first child due in early spring. "More than luck," he corrected softly. "Blessing." They stood together as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The silver locket still hung around Wilhelmina's neck, a connection to a past that had shaped her but no longer defined her future. "Supper's almost ready," she said after a comfortable silence. "I made your favorite stew." Thomas pressed another kiss to her temple. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Yes," she replied with a smile, "but I never tire of hearing it." "Good," he murmured. "Because I plan to tell you every day for the rest of our lives." As they turned to enter the house they had made a home, Wilhelmina felt profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Thomas Norwood into that pawnshop on a desperate day when she'd been about to surrender her most precious keepsake. Instead, she had found something far more valuable, a love that treasured not just silver and photographs, but the essence of her heart, past and present, joined in promise for all the years to come.